neobanks and digital banks in Europe, trends and opportunities.
Okay, so thank you very much for joining us here today. I have the pleasure of having with me here today Zoltán, who is the chairman of the Hungarian Fintech Association and also the managing director of Fintech Lab company. I have the pleasure of having the co-founder of Bankera and SpectraCoin, and Vytautas Kalavikius here, and the Neobank Bankera. And finally, I also have the pleasure of having Pavel and Matveev, who is the co-founder of Wirex here on the podium. Today's topic is going to be neobanks and digital banks and the adoption around that. So let's get going. So first question is to the panel. When we look at the adoption, why is it that people, they prefer a neobank instead of, let's say, a conventional bank? Pavel, please.
Well, people are different, so not everyone prefer neobanks. But what neobanks or challenger banks provide is definitely better user experience and better onboarding. And I've got some kind of personal story just to illustrate that. So I've been living in London for 16 years, and we with my family decided to move to Spain. And when you move to a new country, you kind of need to open a new bank account. So I thought, okay, that's cool. I'll test the banks and just see the user experience. So the long story short, I was testing Neobank, N26, and Santander, which is more like traditional Spanish bank. N26 opened my account, a Spanish IBAN. Took me 5 minutes. I couldn't progress with Santander without going to a branch. So that's kind of illustration. Obviously, I'm just a small segment of customers, but it's a fact that challenger banks, one of the USPs is a better user experience.
Okay, that's very helpful. Vytautas, if you look at what's happening at Bankera, what would you say is one of the main drivers in terms of the audience that's coming to? Is it young people? Is it, perhaps say, older people above 40 who've had enough of a conventional bank? Is it businesses? Who would you say are the main people who decide to go for a neobank?
Actually, I would like to agree with Pavel that the user experience is different. But I think that in general that's a bit changing because, for example, the good example is actually ING Bank in Germany, because they entered from Netherlands as a neobank to German market without any physical presence, and they're also providing this experience which before that was only offered by neobanks like N26, Revolut, and others. And now some of the traditional banks are also kind of moved to this user experience direction from onboarding and the app perspective. But I think what is the difference now, and especially from our business case, is actually that neobanks now they have two aspects. Not only talking about the user experience. One thing is actually about being able to understand the, let's say, modern clients. One of the examples actually even the people who are just changing the countries. Because most of the traditional banks, they are comfortable to onboard you if you have been born in that country, you have lived there, and you are normally employed. But let's say if something is different, let's say your income is not from employment, you just change the country, you will actually become kind of a high risk for a traditional bank. While the neobanks, just because we are trying to get the clients all around Europe, therefore they are much more flexible to onboard the, let's say, digital nomads on that perspective. Another perspective is also regarding the risk appetite, because neobanks, they try to understand the new businesses.
Zoltán, you are the chairman of the Hungarian Fintech Association. How are you seeing this kicking in after all, we're in Budapest, Hungary today. How do you see this kicking in the Hungarian market? Because, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I only seem to recall large, let's say, conventional bank names in Hungary like OTP Bank. How is that progressing in the Hungarian market?
Yes, sure, actually. Neobanks are very popular in Hungary too. And I say that I work at an incumbent bank, MBH Bank. This is the second biggest bank in Hungary. So, and I'm the managing director of MBH Fintech Lab. So we invest in companies, in fintech companies, even in neobanks. So we are making experiments with them. Actually, my initial thought about your initial question was that neobanks usually don't start out as a bank. It's a technology company which is focusing on a specific segment and providing excellent user experience for youngsters, underbanked, unbanked population, SMEs maybe. So the formula is the following. It's a technology company. They can provide excellent UX, the daily banking services, with word of mouth and excellent marketing. They can build a community. They can increase the amount of their wallets. And then they can provide more solutions, more services to their customers. And in this phase, they are not entirely neobanks. They started to becoming a global universal bank.
So with that said, Vytautas, at Bankera and what you generally see in the market, who would you say of the customers that come to neobanks are the most problematic, that you think that conventional banks are happy to get rid of, and you guys as neobanks are not so happy to have knocking on your door? Is it SMEs? Is it young gamers who have a lot of transactions going on? Which ones are the more problematic ones?
I think the problematic can be looked from both sides, because, for example, there are industries from which the clients for us would look problematic. For example, logistics, while for a traditional bank it would be like a normal client. And I think that's the difference between the banks over long term. But let's say with Bankera, we focus on the crypto clients, iGaming clients, and we can understand them. Let's say we can know our clients, and therefore we can onboard them and provide a better experience than somebody else. While traditional banks choose other industries in which we are stronger and we know these clients best. Because the general change in the market is that actually all the apps are available for both traditional banks and neobanks. The payments are becoming instant in all the dimensions, including the cross-border payments. So the only lag is going to be actually about the compliance, about how fast you can open the account, how fast your transaction can be approved, and that links how well your bank can understand you and know you. So I think there's going to be it's not going to be any more neobanks or banks. It's going to be the banks which specializes on some industries in which we can be as fast as possible because we know what we're doing.
Okay, so with that in mind, Pavel, you are a man who's up there amongst the bigger neobanks. What do you say when people claim that neobanks are actually just having more lax compliance, and that's why they will accept a lot of stuff which conventional banks would perhaps not?
Look, at least we lasted 10 minutes before we started talking about compliance, but I not necessarily agree with this statement that the challenger banks are lacking in compliance. I think the problem of traditional banks that they using the legacy approach. So that's why sometimes people see, okay, they just ask more stuff. That's why they're more compliant, which is absolutely, incorrect. What challenger banks do instead, they're using, the electronic forms to verify your address, for example, or different mechanics, which is more user-friendly. So that's just, part of our answer. But the second one, again, that's more kind of Wirex-related example. So Wirex also providing cryptocurrency services. And we quite old business, old, mature is the right word. But we've been in the space for 10 years, and 5 years ago, when you started talking, we're doing banking services and crypto, people look at you like, you're from the bad neighborhood. So during our entire history, we had to overcompensate when it comes to compliance and different transaction monitoring. So Wirex, for example, is doing much more than Revolut in terms of monitoring, because we had to overcompensate. Because by regulator, we always seen hey, these guys are doing crypto, so something dodgy there. But yeah.
And what would you then say on that basis, Vytautas? How do you see that market going from the compliance point of view? Would you say that things are getting harder, or are things getting easier?
in general, things are getting harder from the compliance, from the regulatory perspective. But that's actually what I said about being able to know your client easiest, because it's not actually about asking as many questions as possible, because even sometimes when the regulator will come to audit you, they will say that you are inefficient because you are asking too much. Because the point is actually to be able to know your client, so it can be even public domain or it can be other know-how, that you actually asking the right questions and you're actually able to mitigate all the potential risks. It's not about asking 100 questions. It doesn't make your operations less riskier. It's actually about being able to identify that and to cover that. So I think it's getting harder, but it's getting harder in that sense that it's not anymore a checkbox what you have to collect. It's actually about being able to stand for each of your client and to defend that against auditors, regulators, that you actually know them. Because if you look at the most of the compliance-related fines, it's not so much about the actual money laundering or actually about the actual bad actors. It's more or less about not having the strong procedures to collect the information about the good clients. Because usually the actual money laundering goes in the closing down of the companies or criminal investigations. But when you are getting the administrative fine, it means that like you haven't checked the proper clients properly.
Right, so you're basically saying it's a systems and procedures kind of structure that the regulator is seeking. Zoltán, when you, in your setup, go through investments into, let's say, fintech firms, leading on to neobanks, as you were explaining about, the life cycle of how they develop. How do you then go over the compliance side? Do you hire external people? Do you do it yourself? How much do you lean upon the regulator? Because you, through the Fintech Association, must clearly also have some, let's say, political connections, right?
Yeah. I think if a fintech or a neobank doesn't take the compliance question seriously, the game is over for them. So it's my very first question as an investor, and personally I don't like the compliance or regulatory arbitrage, exporting the licensing, and of course fintechs sometimes living on the edge, but it's about finding the fine balance, between to be compliant and to be innovative. This is the hardest part of launching a fintech company. I think it's in every country, all over the world.
And if we didn't take that as an example, how would you then say, where are things heading from here? Because a lot of conventional banks have much higher costs because they have the legacy set up with branches. They have, let's say, much more, let's say, senior staff in terms of age inside the organization because they've been going for decades, centuries, whatever. How do you see that whole thing going on in terms of, will conventional banks become neobanks one day, and anybody who's above 55 and does not know how to use all sorts of apps, they get fired or go into early retirement? How do you see that happening in terms of that transformation? Pavel, please.
Yeah, to your point about branches, actually a lot of traditional banks are closing branches. At least I live in London, it happens, quite a lot. Just a couple of trends. Traditional banks, like big banks like HSBC, they catching up with user experience. If you just HSBC user, but if you compare your application now to what was 3-4 years ago, it's a huge improvement. And in terms of user experience, it's very similar to challenger banks. Historical or traditional banks, there's kind of a difference between neobanks and challenger banks. Neobanks game, or fintechs in general in Europe, was a loss-making. There was a competition like, who is losing less. It wasn't competition who is, making more money. But the things change now because we're now living in a high-yield environment. For all fintechs or neobanks now either became break-even or profitable. So that's kind of another source of revenue for them. I think this trend will continue, and traditional banks will improve their user experience. But also for fintechs and challenger banks, there is a new source of income revenue, which is coming from high-yield products, which is great. So I think this competition will increase.
And yes, please, Zoltán.
So may I answer to these questions? So I think the future is not about we have to choose between banks and neobanks. It's about who will be the owner of certain ecosystems like health, like mobility, like home, because incumbent banks, universal banks, they are introducing beyond banking solutions all the time, and technology companies can provide daily banking, excellent daily banking services. So it's about owning the ecosystem, gaining as much data as possible about the customers and serving them professionally. And it means, of course, that the big universal banks will become a much more digitalized tech company. Like not like now, actually. They have to get rid of their legacy core banking system at first. This is a must.
Okay, so Vytautas, based on what you see out there, how many customers are looking for, you know, we have been talking about high yield interest rate environment, you know, whether people find they can get a deposit on their money. How many people come to somebody like yourselves, or what do you see as general trends because they feel they can get a better deposit on their money in a flexible manner, whereas at the bank they feel that, you know, the profit cut that the bank takes is too high, or the method of which they have to go through the process of depositing the money is too complex?
What I know from my experience in general is actually that like young people who are savvy enough to look for the high yield products, they sometimes even go for the riskier products, even like the crypto products, staking and so on. While let's say the older generation who are also, let's say, trying to look for the high yield, they actually go to what is kind of like the things like the credit unions or so on, the things which are kind of opposite from the neobanks, because sometimes we even don't have an online presence. But like when they find these people through offering the high yield because they have a cost much lower, because they even don't have like any technology cost. They have like a couple of physical offices, that's it. So I think like the neobanks, some of them say attracting the clients in the same way as the traditional banks. But if you look at the yields offered by neobanks and traditional banks, they're more or less the same. What is probably the difference in the current offering, I think, is that the neobanks manage to offer securities and other products in a user-friendly way, where traditional banks are still missing out. I think like traditional banks will start offering the brokerage services in a user-friendly way probably in the next 3 or 4 years, while the neobanks have already catch and like took this area.
So when we talk about, you know, the cost aspect of running a conventional bank compared to running a neobank, my question to you is then, is it potentially possible that neobanks at some point, let's say that we stay in a higher interest rate environment, you know, not that we go back down to zero, but we stay somewhere around here, that neobanks at some point might become more profitable per customer or, you know, per million allocated capital than a conventional bank? Pavel?
That's a very good question. I do think it's possible. So if the high yield stays, or maybe it drops just a bit, but we stay non-zero environment, that's possible because the neobank has this technological advantage. So the cost, because it's very new, right? So it's a new infrastructure. Then don't bring all the legacy branches, people, processes, because they're new, they're more cost efficient. And if the revenue is kind of the same or higher, yeah, I think it's doable. Look, if you have a look at the latest data from Revolut, right, it's like 400 million in profit. Well, that's decent profit.
But then they also had losses until then of what, 10 billion, or what are we at now?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Okay, so Vytautas, where do you see that going in terms of a trend? Do you believe neobanks have a potential of being more profitable than conventional banks over time in a higher interest rate environment?
I think in the long term, the neobanks will start to offer, well, say, the long-term products as the traditional banks, like mortgages and so on. Like you can see, like even some of the neobanks entering in that area, and I think like that the difference will disappear, and I think like we're gonna be on the long term become as profitable as traditional banks, because I think now you have some difference because some traditional banks we have locked in rates for the people who borrowed money from them. So that's why in the short term, maybe like the neobanks can outperform it because we don't have like some negativity from the higher interest rates. But I think after long term, when we equal out the portfolio, we're going to be more or less the same. Then it's going to be, let's say, the legacy cost, which might be harder for the traditional banks to reinvent themselves from technology. But I think up to 20 years or 10 years, the legacy cost may also catch up with current neobanks, and then we'll have a new wave of newcomers and new neobanks.
Very interesting. Zoltán, you are more on the investment side, from what I understand. How is that for you in terms of when you then look at investing into a fintech, potentially neobank, how important is the profit matrix in that whole calculation versus where you say, well, this business might be a lot bigger? You know, are you chasing more profits or are you more chasing like growth numbers? How does that look?
Now it's much more important for me than it was 3 years ago, because due to the higher interest rates and then venture capital funds just drying out, it's much more important to make profits nowadays. And but I think the most important thing is how they can create value for a specific segment. The time works for the neobanks because as an incumbent bank, we have many elderly people as clients, and we have to serve them in branches. As for the youngsters, it's not a big deal. They don't want to get in a local branch. It's not so important for them. Actually, they hate it. But we have to, the maintenance cost and everything. And in the long run, everybody will be very well digitalized, much more digitalized than nowadays, and maintaining a huge infrastructure like now, it's not going to be so important. So now what I'm searching for in the new fintech companies is creating value. The user experience is a must, I think. They have to be excellent, and this is the first threshold.
So based on what you're explaining here, Zoltán, Pavel, you also mentioned earlier HSBC having picked up a lot over the last few years. Do you as panel attendees believe there might come a point at which conventional banks will say, look, Bankera, Wirex, whatever, just go to those guys, this is the check, tell them we'll take the keys and they can go to the beach and we'll take over that business and integrate it as our own kind of online neobank because it's a much faster way of getting technology whilst also getting a customer segment. So in short, do you imagine there's got to be some sort of acquisition consolidation happening at some point, Pavel?
Well, M&A is definitely what a lot of banks with money consider. And talking about HSBC, actually, it's another good example. There is a company, Monese, which is quite popular, like a bank as well, challenger bank in Europe. So HSBC, I think, invested in Monese, but in return, it's called strategic investment, but in return, I think they now launch like sub-brand based on Monese technology. So it's not like they bought out Monese, they bought out the product expertise and technology, but they launched their own brand. But some other banks experimented with launching their own challenger banks and they failed. So answering your question, M&A is still kind of on the table, but a lot of banks trying to be clever about it.
Vytautas, you expecting JP Morgan to ring on your doorbell tomorrow morning?
Everything has a price, but in general, I think that can be the thing that like the traditional banks will buy the neobanks for technology, so to avoid this legacy cost. Because, for example, like some of the very decent banks, for example, like Goldman Sachs, around 40% of their staff is actually in IT on one side or another side, and they're constantly reinventing themselves. And many of the proper banks, they actually are more or less IT-driven IT companies. It's not much seen from the user experience, but from the processing side, they're extremely tech-savvy and IT-driven.
I see. Zoltán will hopefully be one of the guys who will come and knock on your door with the check. Unfortunately, time is up, so we don't have time for questions. Thank you very much for being here today. Thank you, Zoltán. Thank you, Vytautas. Thank you, Pavel. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Torben.